Good morning. Welcome to our World War Wednesday presentation today from the National D-Day Memorial. I'm John Long, the Director of Education. And since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis here in the United States, we realized that since people aren't going to be able to come visit our memorial, we needed to reach out with a lot of virtual and digital programming. And we have met that need and along the way found out whole new audiences. Across not only the state of Virginia, but the nation and the world to tune into these programs. And we've also realized it was a great opportunity to collaborate with some of our fellow institutions out there with similar missions, trying to raise awareness of the history of the Second World War and really just history in general. And so the World War Wednesdays were conceived as a way to offer some programming in conjunction with other organizations. And as a result, we have a lot of upcoming events. I'll mention a few that are beginning with tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We will have a live virtual tour of the National D-Day Memorial, weather permitting. It looks okay now. If it happens to be pouring down rain, it might get rescheduled. But we will take you around with the understanding that even though we are reopened, many people are not ready to get out of their homes. And then a lot of people, live halfway across the country and can't easily visit the National D-Day Memorial, but you can virtually. And so tomorrow at 10, join us for a live tour. Go to our webpage to find out some information about that. And then we have our next World War Wednesday program coming up on the 12th, August 12th, and that will feature Woodrow Wilson and the World Wars and helping to connect the First World War to the Second. We've also instituted a virtual book club. Our first offering was yesterday, and we had a great time discussing the book D-Day Girls. But on August 25th, our virtual book club will feature The First Wave by Alex Kershaw, a book obviously dedicated to D-Day by an author who wrote The Bedford Boys and is a great friend of the memorial. And so April Cheek-Messier, our president, and myself, and everyone who tunes in will be discussing that book on the 25th. And then check our webpage because we have other upcoming events and digital programming, all well worth your time. Today, we are privileged to join with the George C. Marshall Museum in Lexington and welcome Cathy DeSilvey, who is the Director of Museum Operations and Collections. And I was joking with her just a few minutes ago. That means she has to do a little bit of everything because that's how it works in the museum world. But Cathy, it's great to have you. Let me start with just a quick question. How are things in Lexington? I understand you're reopening soon.
Yes. Hi. We reopen August 3rd. That's next Monday. We're going to have limited hours, though. It's just going to be 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. and Monday through Friday. And that's just the start of it. But we hope that you all will come and visit us. We're here to welcome you. And Lexington is doing well. And, the students will be coming back probably to post. And we look forward to seeing them as well.
Excellent. I have often said, and I'm sure you agree with me, that George C. Marshall is one of the men who should be much better known to the American public. And so we are delighted to be able to join you to give a program telling us about George C. Marshall from some of the artifacts in your collection. And so I'm going to turn it over to Cathy. Now, as you listen in, if you have any questions for Cathy or about one of the artifacts or about Marshall and his career, type them into the chat feature on Facebook if you're watching on Facebook. And we'll get that and pass them on to Cathy at the end. But Cathy, thanks. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. And I appreciate April, John, and Maggie all helping us get online today so I can talk more about Marshall. A lot of people don't know about him as well as some of the other personalities of World War II. And I thought that picking out some objects kind of inspired by the Churchill in 50 Objects exhibit that was in the UK a few years ago might explain some of why he isn't as well known, and also just giving you some knowledge about the kind of person he was and why he should be more appreciated. So just really briefly, the history of the George C. Marshall Foundation that was commissioned basically by President Truman in 1953, specifically because George C. Marshall refused to write his memoirs. He did not want to talk politics. He didn't want to talk about any controversies that he had. He believed it was private. And his famous quote about that is, you know, I don't need to make any money off of my public service. Like, I was public servant for 50 years and that I did my job. And so he was very humble in that respect. But we have most of his papers in the archive and library. And then his widow, Catherine, also started transferring personal belongings of Marshall's to us in the late 50s and in the 1960s. We were dedicated on the VMI Post in 1964. We are not part of VMI. A lot of people think we are, but we are a separate independent nonprofit, and the state of Virginia basically gave this land to us. And there we are. And so basically, Marshall, to begin with, Marshall, as a child, he was from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. He had a great childhood. But, you know, one of the things that basically begins Marshall's career is listening to his older brother talk to his mother. And if you can just see this screen here of his career, if you think about how it began, basically George is a horrible student. He isn't that great in school. And Stuart, his older brother, has gone to VMI and is talking to George's mother and says, please don't let George go to VMI. He's going to embarrass the family. And this is where Marshall says it had a tremendous psychological impact on him, and he was determined to go to VMI. And so when asked by his biographer, Forrest Pogue, you know, what are you most proud of? Marshall doesn't say, you know, World War II or the Marshall Plan. He says basically becoming first captain of the Corps of Cadets at VMI. He worked so hard. You know, imagine like a 16-year-old recovering from typhoid, getting off of a train in Lexington, Virginia, and walking to post and making it through his classes, making it to the football team, and actually becoming a leader that men will follow. And he does say he learned to manage men. So here's just a recap of Marshall's career. He was in World War I, where he meets his mentor, General Pershing, and he continues Army Chief of Staff for President Roosevelt. He becomes Secretary of State, and we have the Marshall Plan. And also he's Secretary of Defense for the first year of the Korean War. All right. So here are a few themes about our exhibit. We really, Marshall can sometimes be a little unknowable as a person. There are biographies about him, but because he doesn't say a lot in his own words, we need to get the message out about what kind of person he was. The Forrest Pogue interviews, which become the 4-volume biography that Pogue writes, listening to his voice, you can hear what kind of person he was, but he was not a self-promoter. So here we just have some of the themes that I used for this exhibit. So I'm not in the building right now. I'm working remotely today in Lynchburg, Virginia. But just so you get an idea, this is our lower gallery of the museum, and this is what it would look like if you were actually in the exhibit. My coworker, Glenn Carpenter, designed the museum panels for us of the 30 objects. And then we have the cases there. You can get an idea. And if you come visit us, obviously you'll see all this in person. Okay, so item number 1, this special saber. This is fancier than most of the usual sabers that the cadets get at VMI. But this is given to him by Company A when he is first captain of the Corps of Cadets. And basically it was recommended that he was first captain by his VMI tactical officers, 4 cadet captains, quartermaster. And he said about it, he said, I tried very hard. I was very exacting and very exact in all my military duties as I gradually developed from the mild, almost none, exercised by the corporal to the pronounced authority of the first sergeant. And then he says, ambition had set in. The institution gave me not only a standard for my daily conduct among men, but it endowed me with a military heritage of honor and self-sacrifice. So that is kind of where we begin with Marshall's career. So after World War I, he takes this leather briefcase, and you can see if you compare the state it's in now to what it used to look like, it could use a little bit of conservation. But this leather briefcase, Marshall takes to France with him in World War I. He is able to sit for the exam and get commissioned into the Army, and he's kind of in limbo for a little bit. But then he does go overseas with the 1st Division in Pershing. He takes this with him and is the second man off the boat in France. And this is really special, at least for me, because written on it is George C. Marshall Jr. And so at that point, he was still junior U.S. Army. And it has, says it traveled with him through most of his career, 1940. So he was Army Chief of Staff when he still had it. And apparently he was teased mercilessly in Washington for carrying around this tattered, ragged briefcase. But it came with a note inside of it that basically where he says, I carried it with me from June 14th, 1917 until 1940. So Marshall meets Pershing, and Pershing becomes his mentor. They actually become, Pershing ends up being one of Marshall's closest friends throughout his life. And Marshall was not close to a whole lot of people. But basically, he proves himself during World War I. He has an altercation with Pershing, where Pershing is criticizing how the troops look when they're drilling. And Marshall really, he had a temper. Pershing was starting to walk away. Marshall takes him by the shoulder, spins him around, and says, you have to understand, we have nothing here. We're trying our hardest, but without, we have low morale. We don't have any supplies. We're not prepared. You have to have some understanding of where we are right now. And Pershing, luckily, because everyone else thought that Marshall's career was toast at that point, Pershing says, okay, you told it to me straight, and I really admire you for that. And Marshall, Pershing is Marshall's mentor at that point. And a lot about how Marshall leads and makes decisions is influenced by Pershing. So Pershing chooses him for his aide-de-camp from 1919 to 1924. We have the insignia here that Pershing pinned on him. And Marshall, when 1924 comes around and Marshall is moving on, he writes to Pershing. He says, my 5 years with you will always remain the unique experience of my career. I knew I would treasure the recollection of that service, but not until I actually landed here and took up these new duties, not until then did I realize how much my long association with you was going to mean to me and how deeply I would miss it. So Marshall, he does go various places during the 1920s. He does spend some time in China for the first time. But this item, one of my favorite items, is his campaign hat, and it is the hat that he has with him in this picture from Fort Benning. In 1927, Marshall's first wife, Lily, dies after surgery. He had been married to her for 25 years. She lived in what is now the admissions house on the VMI post, and he would sneak out at night and go visit her in his last year there. So 25 years of marriage, very much adored by Marshall, and he's grief-stricken. Pershing had also lost his wife and some children in the fire, and consoles Marshall the best he can but also says, you know, it's best to keep busy. And so Marshall ends up at Fort Benning in Georgia. And this is where we have what's called the Fort Benning Revolution, where Marshall actually kind of creates about 150 to 200 people who will then serve in World War II. And Marshall's learned from World War I that they weren't prepared. It takes a year or more to hand a gun to a soldier, to make them, to have, you know, a uniform for him, to get him trained. It takes longer for pilots. You know, that you can't expect to go to war if you haven't prepared or trained anyone. He sees, you know, officers in the chaos of battle writing out these plans that are, he says, for 1 or 17 pages. He says we need to be able to make decisions without having to write so much down. And so when he comes to Benning, he says, you know, decisions made in battle, you need to learn how to do that. And so he believes there's too much classroom instruction. And so he takes these men out of the classroom, puts them on this 90,000 acres of land at Fort Benning, and he has surprise attacks. They do stuff at night. You know, they give them maps that are wrong, basically trying to prepare them to make these decisions in the heat of battle. And, you know, if Marshall had led troops in battle, he may be more famous than kind of being a logistical genius. But his time at Benning is what kind of helps move the Army forward with how to fight a war. So the campaign hat we have here is definitely a pretty special item. In terms of some of the instructors that came out of Fort Benning, you know, we have Stilwell, Bradley, Beadle Smith, Ridgway, and J. Lawton Collins, to name just a few. So Marshall almost gave up on the Army. He actually thought maybe the Army had given up on him. He did not get his first stars until 1936. In October of 1918, Pershing had recommended that Marshall become Brigadier General, but Congress had delayed any promotions until after the Meuse-Argonne battle, which Marshall helped plan some of. And when the U.S. when the Allies won in World War I, Congress just, you know, decided there was no reason to do promotions anymore, and he missed out on his chance to become a Brigadier General. It was 18 years before Marshall would receive this rank that many of his first division subordinates already had. These are the silver stars he received, and they are in this box. They were donated by Catherine Marshall, Marshall's widow, and actually they were donated by Frank McCarthy, and Frank McCarthy works for Marshall during World War II, also a VMI graduate and the producer of the movie Patton. But Catherine Marshall had gifted these to Frank McCarthy with a little note on the top of the box that said, you know, may these bring you good luck. And then Frank McCarthy donated them back to the foundation. All right, so Marshall was an avid fisher. He was an avid hunter. We borrowed this fishing rod from Dodona Manor. It's a George C. Marshall International Center in Leesburg, Virginia. And it's just mounted on the wall in our exhibit. I don't have a picture of it, but he absolutely loved the outdoors. And he was a firm believer in rest and relaxation. Now, a lot of people assume that Marshall was a workaholic, you know, type A personality, because he got so much done. But this item, I felt, signified that you really need to have this work-life balance. And so in 1939, he actually writes to Brigadier General Bruce Magruder, and this is this is one of the best pieces of advice that I've seen from Marshall. He says to him, "I counsel you to make a studied business of relaxing and taking things easy, getting to the office late, taking trips, and making everybody else work like hell. I woke up at about age 33 to the fact that I was working myself to death, to my superior's advantage. From that time on, I made it a business to avoid, so far as possible, detail work, and to relax as completely as I could manage in a pleasurable fashion." And so he really, a lot of people think Marshall did not take any vacation. He did. Him and General Hap Arnold went hunting and fishing often. He would go fishing with General Bradley. And he really believed, like, to survive in this line of work, you really needed to take care of yourself. Okay, item number 7 is another loan that we got from Dodona Manor. I would highly recommend that you visit Dodona Manor in Leesburg as a house museum. It's quite amazing, and it's just a fascinating place to kind of see. You know, there's a lot of items and furniture from both times that Marshall was in China, and it's very quaint and has beautiful gardens because Marshall loved to garden as well as part of his relaxing. And so Marshall, he was a student of history. He believed in the importance of historical study. He told some Princeton students in 1947, and this is another quote that just gives you another aspect of his personality. He says, "I doubt seriously whether a man can think with full wisdom and with deep convictions regarding certain of the basic issues today who has not at least reviewed in his mind the period of the Peloponnesian War and the fall of Athens." And so he, as a student of military history, voracious reader, and he also read, Westerns and entertaining things. He really believed in looking to the past for the lessons of history. If you analyze these battles, you would see, and he also mentions this when he wins the Nobel Prize, and he is talking to students and education in his speech and teachers. He says, all students should go back to these battles and determine the moment that the wrong decision was made. So you can recognize how a series of events, so you don't repeat them, essentially. And so Marshall would use, if you do this, well, this would probably happen. And he really, in a lot of his speeches, he really tried to get this across. So people could learn to make different decisions, and maybe there would not be these world conflicts. And here is just I borrowed 19 books from Dodona Manor, and there were everything from books on, New Orleans. He really enjoyed New Orleans. There's one called The Riddle of MacArthur, which I found fascinating. Alone, he helped finance some of Richard Byrd's, personally, Richard Byrd's Antarctic quest, and How Prayer Helps Me. There are books on hunting and fishing, just all sorts. And some of them are Catherine's too, but in this batch, they're mostly Marshall's, some military history books. All right, item number 8 is the Jeep. Now, we call Marshall a father of the Jeep. He helped push the Jeep into production. And the anecdote goes that Assistant Secretary of the General Staff, Beadle Smith, he interrupts Marshall's meeting and says that this representative from the American Bantam Car Company is out, wants to talk to somebody. His design has been rejected by other departments. And Marshall says about this, Smith took about 3 minutes to pitch it, and I said, well, what do you think of it? He said, I think it's good. Well, I said, do it. Smith sent 5 to Fort Knox to the chief of the Tank Corps. As I recall the incident, 2 weeks later, he asked for $38,000. The artillery wanted some, quartermaster, of course, wanted some. All these people who had turned it down all wanted some. And so Marshall had been looking for kind of a low silhouette all-terrain vehicle for soldiers, basically ever since World War I, when he saw these wagons with horses getting stuck in the mud. And so he did basically, you know, one of Marshall's gifts was having men around him who could think independently and make their own decisions. And Beadle Smith was one of them. And if you had employees that could make their decisions, it takes a lot of the responsibility off of you. You don't have to look at every single thing. And so with Beadle Smith's guidance, Marshall was pushed the Jeep into production. The rest is history. All right, from our archive, we do have a lot of Marshall's personal papers and professional papers as well. And this is where one of Marshall's famous quotes comes from. And this was not something he said publicly in a speech. It was in a private letter. And so I don't think he meant for it to be read, you know, as I'm reading it now, but it's quoted quite often. So Charles Graham writes to Marshall and basically invites him to the Woodmont Rod and Gun Club. But in the letter to Marshall, Charles Graham says, am inviting Wendell Willkie, and while he may not be of your own political faith, he is certainly 100% for the administration in connection with his foreign policy, and I'm sure you would enjoy knowing him. And so if you can see that little handwritten note down there is from Marshall, he circles the phrase, your political faith. And he writes, I've never voted. My father was a Democrat, my mother was a Republican, and I am an Episcopalian. And this was Marshall's policy his whole career. He did not get involved in politics. And that is why he was one of the most trusted people in Washington, D.C. Some people don't think this is a noble quality, that he never took a stand or he never took a side, but he believed that politics should not be, the military should stay free of politics, and a lot of decisions should stay free of politics. And he would tell people like Eisenhower, don't get into politics. And I have another quote that he wrote to a young friend of his who was a young woman that he had met when she was a child, and they corresponded his whole life. But he wrote to her, he said, did you ever read Will Rogers' definition of politics? The one I refer to is, there is no more independence in politics than there is in jail. And I just thought that was kind of a funny quote. And this is one of the reasons why the Marshall Plan is able to pass legislation on both sides, because he was very objective. Okay, item number 10 is a photograph that I picked out. This is actually one of my favorite examples of Marshall. Marshall was kind of an expert at propaganda. You don't really think of him that way, but he realized when soldiers weren't interested in necessarily hearing people speak, but maybe watching movies would be better. He got Frank Capra to do the Why We Fight series of videos. He was very involved with the Office War Information, and he knew how images, photographs, the power that they had as well. And this photograph in particular, and it is a Getty photograph by Otto Bettman, which we use with permission. But as early as, Marshall is sworn in as Army Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, and this is the day that Hitler invades Poland. This, in February of 1939, Marshall asked the Army War College to examine what would be needed to make Brazil and Venezuela, I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here, safe against Nazi influence. And, they looked at the bulge, the port of Natal, as being this vulnerable spot, and most people with World War II knowledge know this. But in 1939, he says, we need to get down to Brazil and establish an American presence there as soon as possible, the way that things are going. And so this image features Marshall with the service ribbons on. And the interesting thing is that they're foreign, they're international, essentially. And I have a list here, Philippines, a Panamanian medal, French, Brazil, Italy, Montenegro, Ecuador, Peru, Morocco, Cuba, and Chile. And this picture basically says, these are our allies already. You can't, they're on our side. We've claimed kind of that territory. And it's just, for me, this is just one of the more powerful photos of Marshall. Okay, in our archive, we also have Marshall's correspondence with the Tuskegee Institute. And Marshall, he supported the aviation program, and he talked to the president, he wrote back and forth to the president, who needed, money, needed supplies, needed places for these African Americans to relax and enjoy themselves. They weren't allowed in any officers' clubs. They didn't even have, they couldn't go into towns in the South safely. And Marshall ends up donating some of his own money to the Tuskegee program. And President Frederick Patterson was often just trying to get more support, and it was really hard. And Marshall wrote to him, you could probably use some vocational or manual training equipment. Here's some federal programs. When Frederick Patterson says, could you donate, even like 50 cents or $1 to help a student or two, Marshall says, let's send them a check, and sends them a check for $50. And it just, he believed that everyone should be able to serve. And also it was a manpower issue. I mean, he was recruiting actively. And he does reflect later in his career that sending African Americans to the South to train, to him, was a practical decision. You could have training, aviation training and things all year round, because the winters were mild. And he realized that the South just wasn't the place for African Americans at that time, that he should have thought of a different location, because it was hard on morale for the soldiers down there. All right, and item number 12, I picked out this bust that is on loan from the VMI museum system. And this was dedicated in the middle of World War II at VMI. It was in Preston Library originally, and then it was loaned to us in 1964 when somebody at VMI complained about it and called Marshall communist for not being able to make peace on his mission to China in 1946, because he, that was one of Marshall's failures, was he could not make peace between the nationalists and the communists. And so we got it in 1964. But at the time, it was basically, it's quoted, Frank McCarthy is there for the dedication, and he says, it's a symbol, the highest symbol of VMI's participation in the war. And Marshall is the only 5-star from VMI, several, from West Point. But, it's VMI's kind of way of claiming Marshall at the time in 1943. The sculptor, Nice and Tregore, was also one of the monuments men. Just some trivia there. We have another archive document here. And this is the WAC Anti-Discrimination Order of 1944. The Colonel Oveda Kolpabi was having some issues with, well, the WACs in general were having some issues with recruiting because of things that had gotten out in the media. And she said, there's an attitude of soldiers to women in the military services, which is really hurting our recruiting abilities. Citing a major general's remark in a national magazine that he, fortunately, had no experience working with the WACs and did not want any WACs in his command, Colonel Hoppe noted, the attitude of the officers and enlisted men in the field will never change to the degree desired as long as key personnel, whose expressions can be assumed to reflect the War Department attitude, make statements such as these. Marshall immediately realized that we were recruiting WACs to take the place of men in jobs so the men can go fight overseas. If we don't have women taking the place of these men, we can't send the men overseas. So to him, it's another morale and recruiting issue. And he sends this message out to every theater. And in it, he says, the Women's Army Corps is now an integral part of the Army and a highly essential part of our war effort. Its units have met their responsibilities with efficiency and are rendering an invaluable service. However, reports indicate that there are local commanders who have failed to provide the necessary leadership and have, in fact, in some instances, made evident their disapproval of the Women's Army Corps. The attitude of the men has quickly reflected the leadership of their commanders, as always. And so he takes care of that pretty quickly. There were still issues, but Marshall would have none of it. All right. Item number 14, we have a saddle. This is an Italian saddle he bought from Milan, or it was shipped from Milan. He said by the time he was at Fort Leavenworth, Marshall, he's rode practically every day. I bought a young horse and trained it. I wanted to learn to do that. And the saddle was designed by Italian cavalry captain Federico Caprilli and required the rider to adapt their movement to the horse and not the other way around, as in classical riding. And Marshall was another avid rider. He was an equestrian and enjoyed, this was also just a kind of a work-life balance thing. He really enjoyed getting out and going for a ride every morning where he could, usually at Fort Myer. Item 15, we have this kind of graphic propaganda poster. He would have had to approve this, and seeing it, you're wondering, who is that? Whose son is that? Whose brother is that? It's not like a lot of other propaganda posters that have come out. Marshall, when it looked like the tide was turning and the U.S. is now going to maybe, they're winning battles and things are looking good, he realizes that back home, the general consensus is that maybe, we don't have to work as hard because we're winning. And he said the morale and the energy of the civilian industrial workers was waning. He says recently, these are his words here, recently it has appeared that our forces have gained positions from which to strike at the heart of Germany. And just as they are breaking into the last Japanese outpost, the feeling that an early victory is assured causes certain of our people to relax in the war effort and turn to other considerations. So he felt he needed to remind them that it's not over. Keep working. Item 16 is actually untitled, but the museum named it Church at Vaux. It's set in Vaux, France, World War I. The black and white image of it that you can see there is the original photo. And General Pershing said that this picture exemplifies the spirit of the American soldier and is hereby officially designated as the spirit of the AEF. And this was Marshall's favorite picture from World War I. Tired of images of American soldiers shown drinking and carousing, he commissioned an oil painting of the photograph to hang in his office at the Pentagon. And there's a picture of the artist. It's a little funny because the artist, Wallace Broger, had been doing art therapy with wounded veterans in the upper Midwest, and mostly worked in watercolors. And somehow it came across Marshall's desk that this artist was up there, and Marshall said, "I want this painted in oils." And Broger said, "I've never worked in oils before." And Marshall ordered him to do it, just, and he said, "Okay." And it turned out nicely. It's a beautiful picture. And the only complaint when the artist dropped it off was that Marshall said that the soldiers looked a little too clean, because if you look at the image, you can see kind of how battle weary they are. Okay, item number 17. I think this is my personal most favorite item that we have at the museum in terms of its symbolism, in terms of its provenance. We basically know most of the whole story of this and where it came from. Mussolini's broadsword. So this steel and gold broadsword was presented to Mussolini on the 10th anniversary of the March on Rome. And so the March on Rome was October 1922. So in 1932, they have a year-long celebration of the March on Rome, where you have architecture being built and these big parade routes and cinema, and Mussolini's kind of going around being worshipped by his people. And the city of Bologna gives him this sword as a gift. It's 54 and a quarter inches long. It probably weighs about 25 pounds. It's huge, it's impractical, it's for decoration. It's not for using in battle, obviously. But when Mussolini is deposed, he is set up on Lake Garda. And in the lower right, you can see the picture of what it looked like then. And Mussolini actually called this a prison. He was very unhappy there, but he took a lot of his possessions. And in a nighttime raid across Lake Garda, the 10th Mountain Division comes across and loots the palace. And Mussolini's already been killed. But the sword is given to Lucian Truscott, who was head of the 5th Army at that point. And Lucian Truscott actually later presents it to Marshall. And I see this as kind of the Mussolini gets it for the founding of fascism, but Marshall gets it for the defeat of fascism. And so it kind of has this full circle appeal, and you need to see it in person to really appreciate it. But some of the symbolism on it, we have, this Benito Mussolini inscription here where he's in his World War I uniform. And it basically says, you're Il Duce, you're magnificent. This is for the 10th anniversary of the March on Rome. And on the other side, we have, his symbol, the eagle holding the fasces, and a Latin inscription, which basically means to our greater fate, or to Italy's future. The scabbard has Medusa's head on it as the evil eye, like, I'll defeat you if you try. And so that is, that's a great item there. One of the more important documents that we have in our archive is the speech that is known as the Marshall Plan speech that Marshall gives to the Harvard Alumni Association. It's actually always referred to as a commencement speech, but Marshall did not speak at the commencement. This was after the commencement, where he received an honorary doctorate. Marshall outlines very strategically, with the help of Charles Bolin, George Kennan, that post-World War II, Europe, learning from the lessons of after World War I, when Germany, the Nazi Party, comes to being and there's another war, Marshall says if this happens again, it will probably be Russia. And we need to rebuild essentially Europe, get them trading with each other again, to prevent this from happening. Besides the fact that, it was just, Germany was decimated and people were starving. And so he gives a speech, which is, basically says to Europe, we are here to help you if you ask. And they responded a short time later. 16 countries did, to begin with. It was offered to neutral countries as well, and it was offered to Eastern Bloc countries, and Czechoslovakia was almost a part of it, but Russia quashed that pretty quickly. Item 19 is our gold-plated Royal Typewriter, and again, for years and years, people tried to get Marshall to write his memoirs, and he just said, my public service is not for sale. The Overseas Press Club on March 4th, 1949, and there's a small YouTube video of this presentation, and an intern also did a small YouTube video on it. Kind of gave this to him as a bribe and said, please write your memoir. But he only used it for his personal use. And related to this object, and this is on loan from the Wynn family. So Marshall's step-grandson. And I didn't add this, but while at Fort Benning, he meets Catherine Tupper Brown, and she becomes Marshall's second wife. And he has 3 stepchildren with her, and he really enjoyed having, he's called kind of an instant family. He really enjoyed children, and he loses his stepson Alan Brown at Anzio during World War II. The Wynn family has loaned us the Congressional Medal of Thanks, this Royal Typewriter, and the Nobel Peace Prize that we have. So directly related to Marshall not writing his memoir is Truman's 1953 mandate that there needs to be an organization to collect Marshall's papers, and that is us. All right, item 20 is something you can see on the post at VMI. This is Marshall Arch. On May 15th, 1951, they have Marshall Day at VMI, and they dedicate this arch to him. It's also his 50th class reunion. And it says, Marshall Arch joined 2 arches named for Generals George Washington and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The program reverently stated, which you can see in the lower left there, through the George Catlett Marshall Arch shall march the cadets of today and the future. And he was from Pennsylvania, and while at VMI, he actually was hazed most of the time and teased for being a Yankee. And he said yes at his 50th class reunion. He said basically, yes, I may be a Yankee, but I'm also the only Yankee with an arch at VMI, teasing them. All right, Marshall's 5-star rank happens in 1944. The idea for the 5-star rank was first proposed to General Marshall by Admiral Ernest King in 1942. King wrote, "We should recognize the fact that there is need to prepare for ranks higher than that of Admiral and General." But later, Marshall tells his biographer, Forrest Pogue, "I didn't want any promotion at all. I didn't need it. I didn't think I needed that rank, and I didn't want to be beholden to Congress for any rank or anything of that kind. I wanted to be able to go in there with my skirts clean and with no personal ambitions concerned in any way, and I could get all I wanted with the rank I had. So that is just that's Marshall's opinion on the 5-star rank, which is still very important. Being one of 9 to have this rank is one thing that makes Marshall special, I think. For one of the creepiest items that we have at the museum on loan from the VMI museum system. And I love this item because it's so strange in a way. So these are his hands that have been cast in plaster by the American sculptor Bryant Baker in 1957. Bryant Baker was mostly famous for his Pioneer Woman bronze sculpture in Oklahoma. Marshall considered sitting for portraits an impractical use of his time. So this is something rare. He just didn't feel the need for portraits to be painted of him, and he certainly had better things to do, is how he felt. But he was known for his expressive hands, and it's hard to, when you don't see a lot of moving images of Marshall, you only see these photographs of him where he's looking kind of stern. It's hard to imagine like his presence. And so, but he was known for these expressive hands. And we wonder at the foundation who talked him into actually sitting and getting this done. If you can imagine him with his hands in casts here, maybe rolling his eyes, but we think it was either his wife, Catherine, or his biographer, Forrest Pogue, probably. Okay. Marshall receives the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program. On December 11, 1953, he accepts this in Oslo, Norway. There were people that were very upset that a professional soldier was getting a peace prize, especially somebody who had had a hand in the atomic bomb. But he says about this, he says, I know a great deal of the horrors and tragedies of war. The cost of war in human lives is constantly spread before me, written neatly in many ledgers whose columns are gravestones. I am deeply moved to find some means or method of avoiding another calamity of war. And he really believed that you needed a strong military in peacetime in order to prevent war. And he also tried very hard to have a universal training. All right, we're starting to get to the end here. Item number 24 is another typewriter that we have, and this is Forrest C. Pogue's Remington Typewriter. Pogue is known as the father of oral history. He was also a combat historian. He used this typewriter to write the 4-volume biography of George C. Marshall, based on interviews with 300 people who had known or worked with Marshall, and over 40 hours of interviews with Marshall himself. And you can see the 4-volume set there, which is a worthy read. I have not finished this set, but I've used this set countless times for reference, for getting quotes from Marshall. I also enjoy interviews and reminiscences. That is basically a transcript book form of all of the interviews. And you can listen to these interviews on our website. In the George C. Marshall section of our website, you'll see a little box that has the interviews. And it's nice to hear Marshall talking about his past. This is kind of an item that one of my former colleagues, Mame Warren, she helped edit the Marshall paper volumes that ended with volume 7 a few years ago. She said, Cathy, you have to put out the bar set because it's kind of this fancy, flashy, beautiful set that you just can't imagine that Marshall would need anything like this, and he didn't, which is why he gave it away. This monogrammed set, we don't know who gave it to Marshall, but when he moved to Dodona Manor in Leesburg, he re-gifts this set to his friend Frank McCarthy. And he often, Marshall was not a collector, so he often gave things away that he didn't need. My opinion of this is that this was probably just way too fancy for him. He just had no use for a silver set here. And Frank McCarthy, I can imagine using it though. But, Marshall's favorite drink was actually champagne. But he would enjoy the occasional old-fashioned. But he would make sure that you put the liquor in before the ice because he wanted to know how much he was getting. He didn't want any surprises. Item number 26 is our building, the foundation itself. And I have a little quote here from 1956 issue of Newsweek magazine, which says, Marshall rejected offers of up to $1 million for his memoirs. He changed his mind because he found a way to tell his story without embarrassing anyone living and without profiting personally. So Marshall did know that this was being planned. There was some correspondence with a VMI alum named John Hagen, who had a big part in getting this constructed and then dedicated. He wanted to make sure that, if there was a right way to skip writing a memoir, maybe having an archive and a library, would be okay. This was dedicated on May 23rd, 1964. And the final volume of the papers of George C. Marshall was printed in July of 2017. Kappa Alpha was founded at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, now Washington and Lee. When Marshall graduates from VMI in 1901, he is initiated that same day into Kappa Alpha, and he was involved with them until his death in 1959. Kappa Alpha has always, they gave financial assistance to create the George C. Marshall Foundation, where the museum and library reside. And they have a George C. Marshall Award that they give out. And recently, we were able to conserve this gold crest here, gold leaf crest of a war memorial that they donated to the foundation in 1965. And you can see this is for World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. The wooden crest had started to separate, so that was conserved recently, and they gave us a grant for that. All right, item number 28. A lot of people don't know, but George C. Marshall did have a submarine named after him, and this is the only ship or anything named after him. It's kind of interesting because, the Marshall Plan pretty much contributes to the start of the Cold War, when Russia doesn't want any part, or the Eastern Bloc countries are not having any part in getting aid from the U.S. The Cold War begins. And so we have a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine that went around the world as a nuclear deterrent. At her launching, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson described the USS George C. Marshall's role in the Cold War. The waves set up by this launching will go to the furthest reaches of our foreign relation. Far beyond the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House, she will add a new factor, a new magnitude to the correlation of forces by which the communists determined their decisions. And it doesn't exist anymore. It was scrapped in the 90s. And we recently had a crew member that a year or two ago gave us a donation of some of his items from his time on the USS George C. Marshall. And he actually was able to go out to Hanford, Washington, and look at where the reactor was buried, which was in this gigantic hole. And it could not be buried because the Soviet Union always had to be able to see it from satellite images that it was still there and not being used again. Now it's buried, but that was just an interesting story about the scrapping of the George C. Marshall. And item 28 is a chunk that someone saved from the hull after it was decommissioned. Item 29 is this one-of-a-kind Marshall Plan volume, and this is not everything, but this is a lot of all the legislation that was involved in passing the Marshall Plan. It was given to us, or it was compiled by Virginia Congressman J. Vaughn Gary. He served as chairman of the Special Subcommittee on Foreign Aid of the Committee on Appropriations during the congressional hearings of the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan. In a letter to Forrest Pogue, Gary wrote, "It was my desire to present to the George C. Marshall Library a complete copy of all the congressional documents touching the Marshall Plan." It is incomplete, but it is still a massive book and really interesting. It shows you how much work went into getting this passed by a country and a Congress that was, did not want to go help their enemies rebuild, Germany specifically. And Marshall said he felt like he was campaigning for president as he went around the country trying to rally support for the Marshall Plan. Our last item is another statue that is on VMI Post. It is in front of Marshall Arch, and it's a 7-foot bronze statue. It was given by the alumni of VMI to honor its leading graduate. It was formally dedicated and unveiled on the parade ground on November 11th, 1978. And it was made possible by funds raised by the VMI Foundation under the leadership of its executive vice president, Joseph D. Nykirk. The statue was designed and created by Augusto Bozzano, an Italian sculptor. And it is just another example of letting people know that, this most famous graduate of VMI, how he changed the world. A lot of people, don't remember Marshall through just this passage of time, through SOLs in school. And it's just serves as another reminder. I always try to point people to the statue. It has everything, a bunch of his accomplishments on the back, just to remind people that, when I've talked to VMI cadets, either in their classroom or had interns or had the rats tour the museum, you try to express why Marshall should be relevant to them. It's kind of hard to tell them why. But I would say that, if someone like Marshall comes out of VMI and says, VMI is the reason I was able to do all of these things, who knows what they could go on to accomplish. And that's what I try to get across when I talk to young people. And that was my presentation of the exhibit. I still hope that you all could come to our physical space, and there's more in the museum as well to see. But thanks so much to the D-Day Memorial for inviting me to do this. I hope you enjoyed it. It's not Marshall's whole career. I mean, there's so much more that he did, but in terms of what we have in our collection, I thought that these artifacts should be included or talked about, to just give you an idea of all the different facets of his personality, of his career. We're all over social media. I also do all the social media for the foundation. And you're welcome to email me also if you want to talk to us, or Melissa Davis is director of the library. All the information's on our website, marshallfoundation.org. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathy. That was fascinating. I joked a week or so ago that the World War Wednesday programs are designed just to make me jealous of other museum collections. Because I know you just scratched the surface of what's there in your archive. And it is a great place to visit, great place to research if you ever have an opportunity. And really appreciate you joining us and telling us a little bit more. We're waiting for some questions, and I have one to start with that I've always wondered about. In Marshall's rise through the ranks in the 20s and 30s, slow rise, of course, in peacetime, but as a VMI alum, did he ever run into a sort of West Point snobbishness, that he was not a West Pointer? Could that explain maybe why he was so slow to get a general's rank?
I can't really say specifically that he made any comments about that kind of elitism. I will say that in 1920, Pershing visits West Point and says, as his aide-de-camp, says, hello, you need to visit VMI now, please. And Marshall brings him to Lexington, and Pershing does a commencement speech at VMI and is there for a little bit. He also talks to Confederate veterans at the time because of Lexington. But Marshall, if Marshall had animosity towards West Point people, he didn't say it out loud. That would have been something people would have wanted to know in a memoir, possibly. He did find himself surrounded by VMI people in the War Department, and he very much wanted to keep it secret because he didn't want people to think that he favored them. And, Frank McCarthy, his assistant, Marshall didn't even realize he was a VMI graduate until they started working together. But, Marshall probably, he did kind of, in a way, he had a chip on his shoulder because he couldn't get into West Point. That was his first choice, but because his dad was a Democrat, he didn't. But at the same time, he stays at VMI. He doesn't transfer to West Point. I mean, George Patton spent a year at VMI and then transferred to West Point, and Marshall didn't. He stayed there and was always very much attached to VMI and his time in Lexington.
Okay, well, I don't believe we have any questions that are coming in through Facebook or YouTube, so I guess we will hold it there. I want to thank you again for joining us, and encourage all the folks watching. If you get a chance to go by the Marshall Museum, spend some time there, you will be exposed to one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. And as I said, to start out, a name that really everyone should know. I've always thought it's kind of an injustice that everyone knows the name of Patton, everyone knows the name of MacArthur, and Marshall. He in his overall impact really exceeded them all and made the 20th century in so many ways. So again, thank you, Cathy, and
Thank you.
See you
and
soon.
One thing I always tell people about the whole MacArthur and Patton, and Marshall did he did appreciate what MacArthur and Patton had to offer. He liked, and Stilwell, he really liked the guys that would make these decisions and be nonconformist. But I always tell people, I'm like, MacArthur, Patton, Eisenhower, he was their boss.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go into the D-Day decision about Marshall was originally chosen for Overlord, but, Hap Arnold and Ernie King, they go to President Roosevelt and they say, Marshall has to do exactly what he's been doing with you. Do not let him go overseas. And Marshall is he confronts Roosevelt about that, and Roosevelt is okay and says, you know, what do you want? And Marshall says, it's your decision. I do what you tell me to do. And that moment, you know, we say that Marshall kind of loses his historic immortality because he is now behind the scenes and not out front. But Marshall was okay with that.
Roosevelt said, I couldn't sleep if you were not in Washington. And I think that says a lot about the reliance that the president had on Marshall as chief of staff. And
Marshall trusted Eisenhower. You know, he was confident in Eisenhower's ability.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Eisenhower got the job because of Marshall. Yeah, support, obviously. So, absolutely right. Well, again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon. Good luck on your reopening.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for this World War Wednesday, and we'll see you again for the next one on August 12th. Correct? August 12th will be our next one, so join us then.